He said he loved me, and in the same breath, he erased me from the face of the earth. He said, "If you tell the truth, I'll kill you." And I chose silence. That silence became my sentence. 15 years behind bars. But now, with the walls no longer holding me, I'm ready to speak the truth that was taken from me. I stayed silent when I should have screamed, and I agreed when my soul begged me to run. Now, I am no longer the same. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Linda Hayward. I was 25 years old, and I worked as a nurse in a small community clinic in Omaha, Nebraska. My days were filled with the ordinary routines of taking blood pressure, listening to anxious mothers explain their children's fevers, and watching the elderly cling to the last strands of dignity in their fragile lives. I wore pale scrubs, sensible shoes, and my hair tied back in a bun that felt too severe for my round face. I had chosen nursing because I wanted to help, because I believed in the simple power of human touch and care. I thought if I kept giving, I would always have something left for myself. But I did not notice when I began pouring myself so completely into others that there was nothing left inside me to guard my own heart. I first met Mark on a late summer evening when the air was thick with the scent of cut grass and gasoline from the mowers still running in the distance. I had just finished a 12-hour shift, exhausted but restless, and I agreed to join a friend for a drink at a bar near the hospital. He was standing near the jukebox, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his confidence filling the room in a way that made him seem taller than he was. His eyes caught mine, and I felt the air change, as though gravity had pulled me closer. I had never believed in instant attraction before, but that night I understood what it meant to feel claimed without a word. He smiled, and I thought it was warmth. Later, I would realize it was possession. In the beginning, his attention felt like sunlight. He noticed the details no one else cared about, the way I bit the inside of my cheek when I concentrated, how I carried my keys in my left hand instead of my right, the small scar near my collarbone from when I had fallen off a bike as a child. When he told me he liked the way I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, I felt seen in a way I had never experienced before. I mistook his scrutiny for intimacy, his intensity for love. Slowly, his presence expanded into every corner of my life. He began to question the friends I kept, the hours I worked, the outfits I wore. At first, I thought it was endearing that he cared so deeply. When he said he didn't like the way a coworker looked at me, I stopped talking to that coworker. When he insisted that skirts drew the wrong kind of attention, I put them away in the back of my closet and wore only plain trousers and long-sleeved shirts. I told myself it was easier this way, that compromise was the glue that held love together. Weeks turned into months, and soon I found myself declining invitations from friends, avoiding family gatherings, and erasing pieces of myself without protest. My world shrank until it was only him, his moods, his desires, his demands. I measured my worth in how still I could stand when he was angry, and how brightly I could smile when he was pleased. He praised me for being quiet, for staying close, for choosing him over everything else. Each time he tightened his hold, I told myself it was proof of how much he cared. I confused control with devotion, silence with harmony. I remember standing in front of my bathroom mirror one evening, brushing my hair with slow strokes, and realizing I could not remember the last time I had laughed freely. My reflection seemed distant, the girl in the mirror already fading, replaced by someone who was cautious, careful, almost invisible. I had given away my voice piece by piece until there was nothing left to hear. Still, I loved him. Or at least, I loved the idea of him, the man I thought he was when we first met. I clung to that image the way a drowning person clings to driftwood, ignoring the water closing over my head. My heart convinced me that if I kept loving him harder, if I kept surrendering, he would soften, and the man who had charmed me with his smile by the jukebox would return. But love built on fear is not love. It is surrender disguised as devotion. By the time I realized this, I was too deep to climb out. I was bound by the invisible chains of his approval, and I believed that without him, I would be nothing. He had become both my protector and my captor, the reason I woke in the morning and the shadow that haunted me at night. My profession had taught me to preserve life, but my private world had become a slow death, one concession at a time. I had been raised to believe that love was sacrifice, and so I sacrificed myself until I was only a shell, fragile and silent, existing to mirror his desires. I was Linda Hayward, 25 years old, a nurse, a woman who had once dreamed of helping others heal, and instead of saving, I had bound myself to a man who thrived on taking. My life was no longer mine, but I still called it love. That was the cruelest deception of all. The night lived inside me long after it ended. I could still smell the gasoline that clung to the air, the acrid sharpness of it mixing with the dampness rising from the pavement. The streets were slick from a storm that had passed hours earlier, leaving behind puddles that reflected the distorted glow of streetlights. The world seemed suspended in silence, but inside the car the atmosphere was suffocating, filled with his rage that burned hotter than any engine heat. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands pressed together so tightly that the bones in my knuckles hurt, as if holding myself still could make me disappear into the shadows. He drove too fast, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on something I could not see. I knew that look, the tightening of his grip on the steering wheel, the way his breathing became shallow and quick, as though he was bracing for impact long before it came. I had learned over time that when he entered that state, no word from me could pull him back. My silence was my shield, but it was also my prison. I felt every turn in the road like a blow, every acceleration as if the air itself was warning me that something irreversible was approaching. When the car finally stopped, it was not with the gentle easing of brakes, but with the sudden violence of tires grinding against the wet road. I felt my chest jolt forward and my breath catch. The world outside the windshield was empty, but I knew this place was not chosen by chance. He had brought me here with purpose. The neighborhood was quiet, rows of houses half lit, some curtains drawn, some windows dark. It was the kind of street that would be described as safe, the kind where children rode bicycles during the day. That safety shattered in the stillness of that night. I remember the sound of the car door slamming, his footsteps heavy on the asphalt, each one a declaration of his intent. I sat frozen in the passenger seat, gripping the fabric of my skirt as if I could hold myself together. My heart pounded so hard that I thought it might echo in the air and betray me. I wanted to believe it would stop there, that he would walk off his anger and return, but deep down I already knew. I had known since the moment his eyes met mine earlier that evening, dark and unrelenting, promising that someone else's fate had already been sealed. When he returned, his breath was jagged, his hands trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and something darker. The faint metallic smell clung to him, unmistakable, undeniable. My body stiffened, my throat closed, but I forced myself to remain still. His eyes locked on mine, and in that instant, I understood the command before he spoke it. The words fell like a sentence. If I said anything, if I breathed truth, he would destroy me. He did not have to raise his voice. He did not have to strike me. His power was in the certainty that he would follow through. The ride afterward blurred into fragments. The hum of the engine, the sweep of the wipers across glass, the flicker of passing streetlights breaking the darkness into pieces. I stared out the window, unable to see anything beyond the reflection of my own pale face. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and absolute, filled only with the echo of his threat. I was a nurse, trained to heal, trained to save lives, but that night I became complicit in something that stole life away. I felt the betrayal of my own oath like a knife, but the fear inside me was sharper still. When the flashing lights appeared in the distance, I knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. The officers approached with the calm authority of men who had done this many times before. My body moved mechanically, stepping out of the car, standing still as questions fell around me like shards of glass. I heard my own voice answer, flat and controlled, taking the blame into myself as if it had always belonged there. I saw the faint curve of satisfaction on his lips, the ease with which he let me shoulder the weight. My silence was his freedom, my guilt his escape. The courtroom came later, but in many ways, the trial began that night. The decision was made not in front of a judge, but in the front seat of that car, in the exchange of a glance and a whispered threat. The sentence was written in the choice I made when I swallowed my words and let fear consume truth. 15 years stretched before me like a road I had already begun walking, even as I stood there under the cold glare of headlights. That night, the woman I had been ceased to exist. I had thought love meant sacrifice, but love twisted into fear became obedience. My heart, once so eager to give, became a vault that locked away the truth. And in the silence of that vault, I sentenced myself long before the world did. The night everything changed was not only the night of the crime, but the night I surrendered my voice. That silence became the cage I carried into every day that followed. The sound the door made when it closed behind me was not a slam. It was a slow, mechanical groan, final, indifferent. That metallic echo followed me like a shadow for weeks. I stepped into prison not as someone who had been led astray, but as someone who had willingly extinguished her own voice. I walked forward with my hands cuffed in front of me and my heartbeat buried somewhere behind my ribs. I was not afraid of the cells, the guards, or the concrete. I was afraid of the silence that began long before my sentencing and would now grow roots inside cold walls. Intake was a blur of fluorescent lights, barking orders, paper forms, and institutional smells, disinfectant, rubber, sweat. They took my name, my fingerprints, and my clothes. I stood naked in a room full of eyes that didn't see people, only inventory. The cotton uniform they handed me scratched against my skin like it didn't want to belong to a human body. I slipped into it without resistance. Resistance was something I had buried deep inside me long ago. My cell was a metal box, barely larger than a walk-in closet. One bunk, one toilet, one shelf. The mattress was thinner than memory, and the blanket smelled like bleach and old sorrow. I folded my few belongings into a square, toothpaste, a comb, state-issued socks. There was no mirror, just a faint reflection on the stainless steel of the sink, distorted and cold. I barely recognized the shape of my face. The first few nights, I didn't sleep. I lay still, afraid of being noticed and afraid of being ignored. I counted the seconds between distant footsteps. I listened to the sounds of others crying, low, animalistic, broken. Sometimes it was just breathing, heavy and persistent, like the weight of the whole place pressed down on lungs, not shoulders. The quiet was not peaceful. It was punishing. It reminded me of every moment I had stayed silent outside, every time I had nodded when I should have run. In prison, time moved in strange shapes. Mornings started with a buzz and ended with a lock. Breakfast trays slid through slots. clattering plastic and lukewarm eggs. The coffee tasted like burnt paper. I drank it anyway, not for the taste, but for the routine. You learn to survive through repetition. Make your bed, fold your clothes, stand when told, don't speak unless asked. You trade freedom for predictability. It's easier that way. I kept my head down. I spoke little. I became the woman who nodded and followed. The woman who stayed out of fights, out of gossip, out of trouble. Some women in prison became louder, bolder, their voices filling the spaces like fists. Others, like me, folded inward. I watched them with a mixture of fear and envy. They still had something that burned inside them. I had extinguished myself so thoroughly that I didn't even flinch when shouted at. I had made myself into an echo. I found work in the laundry unit. I sorted sheets and uniforms, the fabric stiff with starch and sweat. My hands grew raw from soap and friction. I liked the job. It gave me something to do with my body while my mind floated. There was comfort in the mechanical rhythm. Grab, fold, stack. Time slipped through your fingers when they were always moving. No one expected you to talk in laundry. That suited me. The guards rarely spoke to me. I was obedient, forgettable. That was how I liked it. If they didn't look too closely, they wouldn't see the crack beneath my silence, because under that silence lived shame. Not just shame for the crime I had claimed, but for every moment I hadn't stopped it. For every night I had stared at the ceiling, knowing what he had done, knowing what I had protected. I wore that shame like a second uniform, one that didn't come off at the end of the shift. I received no visitors. He never came. He never wrote. Part of me had expected that. The other part had hoped for it in secret, just so I could see his face and search for guilt in his eyes. But I never got the chance. The only letters I received were official ones, schedules, notices, warnings. I kept them in a shoebox under my bunk, folded neatly. Paper was easier to hold on to than people. Sometimes, during rec time, I would walk the yard in slow circles. The chain link fence surrounded everything. Sky above, dirt below, motion on a loop. Some women played cards or basketball. Others sat with heads pressed against the sun-warmed wall, faces turned up like flowers seeking light. I didn't talk to them. I didn't know how anymore. Words felt foreign in my mouth. I had spent so long being silent that speech felt like betrayal. The worst part wasn't the confinement. It was the forgetting, not by others, but by myself. I forgot the sound of my own laughter. I forgot the way my apartment used to smell after a long shift, the mix of lavender and laundry. I forgot the shape of my mother's voice on the phone. I forgot who I was before silence became my language. I feared that even if someone called my name, I wouldn't recognize it as mine. Still, in the middle of all that forgetting, there was a strange kind of awakening. Not loud, not sudden, just a quiet realization that I was still breathing, still walking, still waking up each day. The silence behind bars didn't kill me. It forced me to sit with myself, to stare at the version of me I had hidden for so long, the version that hadn't fought back, the version that had handed herself over for someone else's crimes. I didn't hate that woman. I pitied her. And slowly, day by day, I began to understand her. I began to hold her hand in the dark, whispering that maybe one day she would speak again. Maybe one day she would tell the truth, not to the world, not to the court, but to herself. And that would be the beginning. The years in prison did not pass like a river. They didn't flow. They sat, heavy, unmoving, stacked on top of one another like cinder blocks. Each day resembled the one before it so closely that time began to lose its edges. I stopped trying to remember how long I had been there, because doing so only made the days harder. But even in that stagnant air, something inside me shifted, slowly, painfully, but undeniably, the first 2 years were numb. I performed routines like a wind-up figure: stand for count, eat, clean, walk, sleep. I nodded when spoken to and avoided eye contact. I worked in the laundry, then in the kitchen, then back to laundry again. I kept to myself. I let time do what it does best in places like that: wear you down. I didn't resist. I let it wash over me, flatten me, bury me. I thought that was what I deserved. But somewhere near the end of the 3rd year, I started keeping a notebook, a small one issued from the commissary, with a green cardboard cover and lined pages that curled at the corners when the cell got too damp. I didn't write about the crime. I didn't write about him. I didn't have the language for that yet. Instead, I wrote about the women around me. Not their crimes, not their sentences, just the way they carried themselves, the rhythms of their speech, the silence that sat between their words. I wrote descriptions, observations, fragments of things that didn't have anywhere else to go. The notebook became my mirror. I began seeing things I hadn't noticed before: the quiet resilience in a woman's posture as she folded towels, the tenderness with which one inmate braided another's hair, the way someone laughed in her sleep like she was visiting another world. The pages slowly filled with pieces of these women, and in doing so, they helped me find the pieces of myself I had hidden even deeper. By the 5th year, I had enrolled in GED classes. It was a choice that felt small, almost trivial, but it marked the first time I had chosen something for myself since before the arrest. I wasn't stupid or uneducated. I had been a nurse. But going to class in prison wasn't about the content. It was about motion. It was about reminding myself that I was still capable of learning, that my mind had not withered in the shadows. I took more classes after that: writing, basic psychology, even a course on accounting. Each certificate I earned didn't feel like an achievement. It felt like a whisper in my ear saying, "You still exist." I taped the certificates to the wall above my bunk, even though they would mean nothing to the outside world. In here, they were sacred. They were signs of life. There were moments of pain that surfaced unexpectedly: a holiday passing with no mail, a guard who looked too much like someone from before, a dream so vivid I woke up crying, clutching my thin pillow like it was someone's hand. Grief had nowhere to go in prison, so it stayed lodged in the chest, heavy and still. But even those moments reminded me that I still felt something, that I had not gone entirely numb. I started talking more, not much, just enough to make eye contact, to offer a comment in passing. I joined a small reading group where we passed battered paperbacks between us and discussed characters like they were people we had known. I found comfort in those discussions: how they let us talk about pain without naming our own, how they gave shape to feelings we didn't yet have permission to express. Around the 8th year, a new counselor arrived. She was young, but she listened in a way that made you believe she hadn't yet forgotten what it meant to be human. I didn't trust her at first. I didn't trust anyone who smiled too often. But she encouraged me to apply for a peer mentoring program, something I would have never considered before. I said yes, even though my voice shook when I did. Mentoring other inmates was the first time I felt useful since I had lost everything. I wasn't there to fix anyone, and I never pretended to. But I listened. I sat with them in their fear, in their confusion, in their guilt. I knew those places intimately. I didn't offer advice. I offered presence. Sometimes that was enough. One day, an older woman asked me how I had survived so many years without going cold. I didn't know how to answer her. I hadn't survived untouched. Parts of me had frozen. Parts of me had broken. But the answer came anyway. I told her that every time I chose to care again, about anything, anyone, I chipped away at the wall around me. And over time, that mattered more than the years I had lost. There were no dramatic revelations. No single moment when I said, "Now I am healing." Healing came in fragments, in the way I stood taller when walking the yard, in the way I looked at myself in the metal reflection of the sink, in the way I no longer flinched when someone said my name. I began to believe that maybe I hadn't been destroyed, just buried. The years had taken much from me. They had taken my profession, my home, my relationships, my identity, but they had also returned something I didn't expect: clarity. The clarity to see who I had become, who I had allowed myself to be, and who I still might choose to be if given the chance. I began to imagine life beyond the walls, not with hope, not yet, but with curiosity. That was new. In the end, the years didn't give me back what they had taken. Time doesn't return stolen things, but it does offer a space where something else can grow. And in that space, I began, quietly, slowly, to grow back into myself, not the woman I had been, not the woman I had pretended to be, but someone else, someone who had survived herself. It didn't come back all at once. The voice I had lost returned in pieces, fragments that surfaced in places I never expected. It began with a whisper, not a declaration, a moment of impulse during a support group meeting when the silence became too heavy, too dense to bear. I spoke before I knew I was speaking. My voice cracked on the first word like it had been buried under rubble and was gasping for air. It was quiet, trembling, unsure of itself, but it was mine. For years, I had built a home inside silence. It was where I had felt safest, where I could disappear without physically leaving the room. I had mistaken silence for strength. I thought that if I could just remain small enough, still enough, the weight of guilt and fear would slide past me unnoticed. But silence is not a shelter, it's a cage. And even the quietest of prisoners eventually reaches for the key. The day I first shared part of my story in that circle of folding chairs and worn carpeting, I didn't plan to. I had sat in those meetings for months, always listening, always nodding, but never speaking. The women around me were like mirrors, fractured and flickering, their pain so familiar it sometimes felt like they were speaking straight from my chest. I thought I was invisible among them, but when one of them said, "I don't think I even remember what I sound like," I felt my body lean forward. My mouth opened. Words came. I don't even remember what I said. I know it wasn't eloquent or composed. It wasn't even the whole truth. Just a small, unremarkable memory. Something about the first time I realized I was afraid of my own laughter because it felt too loud, too noticeable. But the room went still. No one interrupted. No one flinched. They just listened. That small act of speaking, of letting air pass through my throat and shape itself into truth, cracked something open. After that, I began speaking more. Tentatively at first, I would start and stop, sometimes choking on a single sentence, sometimes losing my train of thought in the middle of a word. But I didn't stop. I started journaling again, not just observations and details like before, but memories, moments I had kept locked away. I wrote about the feeling of being watched all the time, about how I had trained myself to read the temperature of a room by the tone of someone's breath, about how silence became my survival tactic. One day, I stood up during a workshop and read a piece I had written out loud. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the paper with both palms just to keep it from fluttering. My voice quivered, then steadied. The story wasn't about the crime. It wasn't even about him. It was about a dream I used to have, where I was underwater, screaming. But no one could hear because the water turned my voice into bubbles. As I read it, I realized I had never really told anyone what it felt like to vanish while still breathing. After the reading, a woman came up to me and said she had that same dream. I don't know if she meant the exact dream or just the feeling. It didn't matter. In that moment, I understood the power of voice, not to command, not to persuade, but to connect, to reach across the abyss of our pain and touch another human soul without needing permission. I began mentoring younger inmates who had just arrived. I didn't tell them how to survive. I simply listened when they needed to speak. I asked questions. I nodded. I created space the way someone once had for me. Sometimes I told pieces of my story, not to confess, not to unburden, but to show that survival wasn't the same as silence, that speaking could be healing, not just dangerous. I remember sitting on the edge of my bunk one evening, staring at the notebook in my lap, and realizing I no longer felt like a ghost inside my own skin. I didn't feel erased. I didn't feel invisible. I was still scared. I was still uncertain about the life waiting for me beyond the walls. But I was no longer silent. There were moments when I still hesitated, times when a guard's voice would rise or a door would slam, and I'd flinch, instinctively folding inward. But the difference now was that I noticed the flinch. I acknowledged it, and I didn't stay curled up inside it. I sat with the fear. I let it speak, and then I answered back. Voice is not just the ability to speak, it is the willingness to be heard. It is the decision to take up space in a world that once told you to shrink. It is the reclamation of something stolen not by force, but by fear. In finding my voice, I found the edges of who I was. I found the contours of my anger, my sadness, my longing, my strength. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to scream. My voice could be quiet and still be real. It could be soft and still be powerful. I had learned to survive without it, but I didn't want to survive anymore. I wanted to live, and living for me meant refusing to be silent ever again. When the gates finally opened, I didn't walk out. I hesitated. For one long breath, I stood at the threshold like someone staring down the edge of a cliff. The sky looked too wide, the light too bright. Everything felt overexposed, loud, fast, indifferent. I had imagined this moment for years, not with joy, but with quiet fear. I wasn't afraid of the world. I was afraid I wouldn't know how to belong to it anymore. They gave me a small duffel bag with the few items I had accumulated: 2 books, some writing paper, a pair of worn sneakers, and a folder with my release papers. I held the bag like it might dissolve in my hands. I had no keys, no wallet, no phone, no home to return to, no familiar voice waiting on the other side, but I had breath in my lungs and the ground beneath my feet. That would have to be enough. The halfway house I was assigned to was 2 towns over. The ride there was quiet. The van's windows were dirty, and I stared out at a blur of trees, gas stations, fast food signs, and houses that looked smaller than I remembered. Everything seemed to have moved on without me. The world hadn't waited. The people walking on sidewalks, checking their phones, sipping coffee, didn't know I had lost 15 years. And why should they? I was just another woman in transit. The halfway house was a narrow building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, it smelled like old wood, cleaning chemicals, and burnt coffee. My room was small, bare walls, a single bed, a dresser, a thin curtain over the window. But it had a door that locked from the inside. That alone felt like luxury. I unpacked my bag slowly, folding each item as if I needed them to fit into this new life more carefully than they had in my old one. My first steps outside alone felt unreal. The sun touched my skin differently, like it had forgotten how to warm me. I walked with caution, every street corner unfamiliar, every sound too sharp. I avoided crowds. I avoided mirrors. I kept my eyes on the pavement. Crossing the street, I would glance up and find people staring at their phones, talking to dogs, or laughing without restraint. I studied them like a language I no longer spoke. I found work at a local thrift store thanks to a program that helped formerly incarcerated women reintegrate into the workforce. The manager was kind but distracted. She didn't ask questions. She handed me a key to the back door and showed me how to tag clothing. I spent my days sorting donations, steaming shirts, and organizing racks. I liked the quiet repetition of it. I liked the way the store smelled: dust, lavender spray, old denim. There was something comforting in handling things that people had let go of, giving them order and new purpose. Outside of work, I attended mandatory meetings, checked in with a parole officer, and kept my calendar filled with structure. It was hard not to fall back into silence, but I forced myself to say good morning, to ask for receipts, to respond when someone greeted me. Each word out loud was an act of rebuilding, a laying of bricks along a road that hadn't existed before. Some days were harder than others. There were nights when I sat on the edge of the bed and couldn't move, the air thick with a grief that had no name. I missed things I couldn't name, time I'd never get back, people who had vanished, a version of myself I would never recover. Sometimes I caught myself expecting to hear cell doors slam or footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Freedom didn't come with silence, it came with echoes. One morning, I walked past a park and stopped to sit on a bench. I watched children climb a play structure, their laughter ringing out like bells. A woman with a stroller passed by, humming to her baby. I looked down at my hands and realized they no longer trembled. The wind moved through the trees without asking anything of me. I didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. I felt like a person learning how to live. Eventually, I began volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends. I helped with intake, cleaned the kitchen, sat with women who had stories in their eyes, but no words on their lips. I didn't need to know what had happened to them. I only needed to be present. Sometimes I told them about the thrift store. Sometimes I told them about the first time I rode a city bus alone. And sometimes I said nothing. Just being there was enough. I didn't look for him. I didn't search online or ask anyone. I had no curiosity left for the person who had hollowed me out. Whatever life he had built without the weight of accountability. That was his burden to carry. Mine was lighter now, not because it was empty, but because I had stopped clutching it so tightly. I got a plant for my room, a small one, with thick green leaves and a name I couldn't pronounce. I placed it near the window, and every morning I opened the curtain to let it breathe. I watered it carefully. I didn't name it or talk to it. I just tended to it. Watching it grow gave me peace. It reminded me that something can take root in unfamiliar soil and still reach toward the light. Freedom was not a door swinging open. It was a series of choices: to speak when silence felt safer, to walk outside when fear told you to stay in, to show up even when you had nothing to offer, to look in the mirror and not turn away. I wasn't rebuilding my old life. That life was gone. I was building something new, something uncertain, something entirely mine. After prison, I didn't become someone else. I became someone more honest, more still, more aware. The years had taken many things from me, but they had also stripped away the noise, the illusions, the lies I used to tell myself. And what remained, bare, scarred, and quietly resilient, was finally mine to carry.